Hello and welcome. Let's take a look at the top story we're tracking for you. The US and Germany turned Zelensky's birthday into a historic day for Ukraine. On Wednesday, US President Biden and German Chancellor Scholz announced tanks for Ukraine's armed forces. Poland, the Netherlands, Spain, Norway and Finland have signaled that they will or are willing to send tanks. The Kremlin hit out, dubbing the tank supply plans a losing scheme and warned they'd go up in flames. But Zelensky's shopping list is expansive. After tanks, fighter jets are now on the top of the agenda. Western tanks for Ukraine once seemed unthinkable. Kiev is now pushing the West to break the final taboo, and officials are already gearing up. Experts say that by greenlighting tanks, the West moved from a defensive support to an offensive support. Ukrainian officials say Western tanks will allow them to shift the tide in the war. The tanks, they say, will allow them to punch through Russian defensive lines and reclaim territory. But Zelensky is persistent. Ukraine wants Western fighter jets next. With depleted strength and dated aircraft, the Ukrainian Air Force is struggling. Western aircraft may be the shot in the arm that Ukraine needs. The Ukrainian Air Force spokesperson said F-16 may be the best option. Ukraine is preparing airfields across the country in anticipation of jets like the US-made F-16 or the French Mirage or Rafale fighters. However, it is not about deliveries alone. Experts say fighter jets are complex platforms needing intensive training. Remember, the Ukrainians fly Soviet-era jets like Sukhois and MiGs. The country's current fleet of warplanes is older than modern Ukraine itself. Western jets like F-16s are a totally different ballgame. The training will last many months, and Ukraine will also need logistics and maintenance systems in place. The time is clearly running out as the Russians continue to double down. Russia has warned repeatedly support for the Ukrainian Air Force would be seen in Moscow as participation in the conflict. NATO has said it does not want a direct conflict with Moscow. Now, for more on this, we're being joined by Edward Joseph, who is a foreign policy analyst. Thank you for being with us, Edward. Now, do you think that, like tanks, NATO would give fighter jets to Ukraine?
Not at the moment. No. Tanks are already a major step forward for NATO, for the United States, for Germany to be sending tanks. This is already crossing a significant threshold, a necessary move, a necessary threshold to cross, but not at this time. The U.S. And NATO would not give fighter jets at this time, and I underscore that point at this time because there was a point when tanks were thought to be overly provocative move. So much of this will depend on the Russian reaction. And that's what drives the decision to provide tanks. And of course, obviously, President Zelensky, he knows and he could use fighter jets to great advantage. But they will not be provided at this time. Please.
On that, Moscow has called the decision to give tanks to Ukraine a provocative move. What could be the Russian reaction if NATO eventually provides fighter jets?
Well, this is, you've put your finger on the real question, because this entirely becomes an assessment on how we in the West perceive Vladimir Putin's moves. Because so much of this, the entire war, including Putin's own strategy, is each side trying to perceive and compel the other side to back down and create the conditions for the settlement that it wants, that Putin wants, and then, of course, we and President Zelensky want as well. So that's what's behind this. And when we hear President Putin claiming tanks are a provocative move, of course, he's doing that because he knows the West is concerned about crossing some unknown and probably imaginary red line in Moscow, which could trigger further escalation and even the threat of using nuclear weapons. So that's what's behind this. But nonetheless, the U.S. sees, and its allies in Germany and NATO see what Putin is doing, how he's doubling down, how his campaign against Ukrainian civilians and Ukrainian infrastructure is just hammering away in the most brutal way, slaughtering civilians. And again, remember, an unprovoked aggression on Russia's part. That's very important for your viewers to understand. Please.
Right. Now, Edward, also, over the past 11 months, the West has changed its stance. From only defensive weapons, NATO is increasingly providing more offensive weapons. How do you see this change in tactics?
Again, great question. And I think there's two facets to this. One is we see what Ukraine has done. And the other, of course, is we see what Putin and Russia have done with their brutality. On the Ukrainian side, the inducement to the West, one of the major inducements is the steadfastness of the heroism, really, of the Ukrainian people, and the steadfastness and heroism of the leadership, beginning with President Zelensky, who, contrary to Western views, didn't flee Kyiv. They stayed in the capital, putting their lives on the line. The Ukrainian citizens who rallied and joined the army, and the army putting their lives literally on the front lines every day to defend their freedom and defend their sovereignty. This is not rhetoric. These are the facts. And that has impressed and inspired the West to understand the threat and to back Ukrainians. And of course, the other part is Vladimir Putin's own reaction. We see, number one, that the Russian military is not so great, and that it's incompetent, and that the Russian military, in response to Ukrainian efforts, and even lost territory. So, and we see, of course, nonetheless, Putin commits and continues to double down, getting conscripts who are completely untrained, throwing them to the front lines, and trying to continue his brutal war of aggression. Please.
Yeah. Also, briefly, perhaps the most pertinent question, when and how could the Russia-Ukraine war end?
Well, it will end when Vladimir Putin understands that he cannot achieve his goals on the ground, and he cannot achieve any more benefit by escalating, even his famous escalate to de-escalate, the idea of threatening to use using a tactical nuclear weapon and then forcing the other side, fearing cataclysmic nuclear exchange, to then back down and agree to his terms. He has to realize that will not work, and that's why giving tanks is a good move, and that's why the more countries that join and back the Ukraine, and back NATO, back the European Union, back the United States, and that send a message, as I believe Prime Minister Modi in India has done, that this is not an era for war, that it was a very useful and commendable message by Prime Minister Modi of India at the summit in Indonesia. Please.
Absolutely. Edward, thank you very much for being with us and your very valued insights there.
You're welcome.
WION, now available in your country. Download the app now. Get all the news on the move.